This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke. Now, this week, by special request, I'm talking about the goddess Diana. Now, if you've been following this podcast for a long time, or have, gone around the YouTube channel or through, the other offerings on Spreaker, you'll see that I did a actual podcast on the goddess Artemis a long time ago. And typically when we're speaking about Roman mythology as it's been developed has come from the Greeks and from the Etruscans. And of course, the Etruscans really got theirs from the Greeks as well. So sometimes you might say, well, you did one on Artemis, what's the need to do one on Diana? The thing is, Diana does actually have some stories and attributes that, while very similar to Artemis, doesn't make her exactly the same. So the focus of this podcast is going to be some of the origins of Diana, who has also, in more modern times, certainly when I had learned about Wicca and witchcraft initially, it was usually Pan and Diana who were listed as the deities. Doreen Valiente, for example, who worked closely with Gerald Gardner, had mentions these two specifically in her Witchcraft for Tomorrow book. And Diana, of course, being a Roman deity, would have had a presence in, certainly in the Britain because there was a lot of, you'll see a lot of temples dedicated to both Greek and Roman deities within Rome, because it was an extension of the Roman Empire. You have the Temple of Mithras, you have a temple, there's been statues found of Demeter, there have been, Aquasulis, which is definitely a very Roman name, who is the goddess associated with the hot springs at the town of Bath. So there's a lot of places, and so there have been temples of Diana. I think up in Chester, there's a temple of remains of a temple of Nemesis. There's a lot of you'll see a lot of Greek and Roman influence. Probably because you have people from that area who have settled there, and you see the particular Roman influence throughout what is now thought of as the United Kingdom. So, with that said, I think what I want to focus on are a few different things. First of all, some of the origins of her. I'm going to give the definition or the explanation of the stories of Diana from the Dictionary of Classical Myth, Penguin Books Dictionary. And then I want to talk about her different epithets and how she ended up having some how some of her associations from Italy actually probably influenced, perhaps either both the modern and the Greek conceptions to some degree. And how her, and some of the mythology, particularly in Ovid and in Virgil, who are the two major Roman writers, poets, that, how those stories have been told, and, what they imply about her as a goddess. And she seems to be very much connected to Artemis. The connection can be pretty obviously seen in the way that they both have this association with hunting, and they both have this association with, with violence or violent death of certain kind. They both have an association with human sacrifice. So, so let's go over everything a little at a time. So I'm just going to reach over here and get my dictionary. Okay. So first of all, this is from the Penguin Dictionary of Classical Mythology by Pierre Grimal. This is one I had from graduate school. And when we look up Diana, this is what it says. The Italo-Roman goddess identified with Artemis. The two oldest of her shrines were the ones at Capua, where she went by the name of Diana Tifatina, and the one at Aricia on the shores of Lake Nemi near Rome, about 11 miles from the Via Appia, where she was called Diana Nemorensis, or Diana of the Woods, or Diana of the Grove. It was said that the Diana of Nemi was Taurian Artemis. Now, we'll talk about that as part of this. Brought to Italy by Orestes. Okay. That may be a bit of a dubious story. As we'll see, the identifications with Artemis, the original Diana, she's talked about as this woodland grove goddess associated with hunting. and maybe even to a certain degree with war. But she is not, but she doesn't really have a particular form until Greek myths and Greek stories end up penetrating Roman myth. At which point, then when we see Diana as looking very much like Artemis, standing there with her, her specific haircut, with her archery equipment, her bow and arrow, that particular image of her really does come from the Greek. The ancient Roman religion is really not. It is very animistic. It's very much, if you study it, oftentimes the ancient Roman deities are classified in terms of flora and fauna. There are deities of the water. There are deities of the forests. There are deities of, the lakes and streams. There are deities of, these various kinds of fire deities. So there's definitely a very strong, when we think of what we think of as the four natural elements, a lot of Roman mythology is based around that. And certainly what we know about the ancient Etruscans, if you Georges Dumazil, who has some theories about the Indo-European origins of this, which some people contest. They say there's not a whole lot of evidence for it. He tries to make a very strong linguistic case for some of these connections. But he actually has an entire volume dedicated to Etruscan oracles. Okay, within his ancient Roman religion, he has 2 volumes on ancient Roman religion, and it's fascinating because, as you might expect from a lot of these ancient cultures, the earth itself, nature itself, contains all of the forces, all of these deities, and they often have a very dark or ferocious kind of connection because, nature can, while nature, provides, it also can be, it also, you could also be hurt by nature. You can also be killed. It's not uncommon to see things like blood sacrifice in association with, quote unquote, the appeasement of nature, or even just in trying to come into some kind of relationship or find your place within those forces. Because, it's not so much viewed the way we view things now, where we take a very analytical approach to deity, to God, to religion, to this idea of God, because we have been so deeply mired in the idea of a transcendent God, and we tend to treat consciousness and rationality and analysis as the basis for that. For one thing, the basis of what we consider to be the superiority of humans over nature, and the thing that sets us apart from the rest of nature. This is not a kind of religion where you are set apart from nature. Okay, so that's something important to understand at the outset if you're not really familiar with the ways of, ancient religion. And of course, when we talk about Roman Diana, certainly she goes through phases. Certainly by the time you get to the Roman Empire and even the writings about her at that point, she becomes kind of conflated with some other deities as part of what they, the Queen of Heaven. So she ends up getting, again, like a lot of the deities of ancient Greece, ends up being given this very celestial role, although as we're going to see, she does have some quite Chtonic attributes. Okay, so I was talking about Tauri and Artemis. I'm going to go on here. It was said that Artemis had given sanctuary to Hippolytus. Now, that's another story connected with her and connected to the virginal aspect of these deities. After his death and the resurrection at the hands of Asclepius, she had brought him to Italy and hidden him under another name in her sanctuary at Aricia, where she had made him priest in charge. Hippolytus was identified with, you can say it Verbius or Werbius. I usually use it with the W because I learned Latin, classical Latin, so my V's are W's. So at Capua, there was a legend about a hind that was sacred to Diana, an incredibly long-lived animal whose fate was bound up with the preservation of the city. Okay, so we see that early connection with Diana and, and deer, particularly hinds. So, and we all have seen the images of her with, the deer as her sacred animal. In the story of Iphigenia, which is one of the Trojan War-associated stories, it's one of the precursors to the Iliad, because the Iliad certainly represents a very late stage in the Trojan War. you have the sacrifice of Iphigenia. She's a blood sacrifice that's, that Artemis demands. And Iphigenia, as the sister of Orestes, you see that Orestes ends up becoming bound up with this idea of Taurian Artemis, which is a statue of Artemis that is brought to the city of Tauris, which is connected with Sparta. And it's, and this, because the Taurian Artemis was something that the Spartans certainly sacrificed to. And, so there seems to be this very bloody association with that particular version of it. And so it's not too weird when you see that Iphigenia is actually considered to be a blood sacrifice to Diana, although in some versions, or to Artemis. But in some of these versions, Iphigenia is spirited away to become a priestess, and a hind or a deer is left in her place. So, there are all of these connections. But again, not to focus too much on the Artemis piece. But it's a little helpful to have context in understanding this other Diana. Now, Virbius is, and were is, vir is like for, we think of vir or virile, right? So that's the root word for man or for masculinity. We talk about a man being virile, like he's very, very manly. And it's interesting because he ends up being, fighting and being killed. And there's a tradition with this particular Diana Nemorensis that her priest has to be a runaway slave, and that this priest is named, the Rex Nemorensis, the king of the, of this particular grove or temple. And it's near the Lake Nemi, okay, which is presumably what this grove is named for. So, this particular, what the priest ends up having to do is fight to the death. And then once that priest is killed, then the conqueror is the one who, takes the place and becomes the new priest. And it's interesting because there seems to be some relationship between that and what we think of as the gladiatorial fighting, usually done by slaves. Slaves are prisoners, but those kinds of, this sort of game element, this hunting element, you're actually talking about human beings kind of hunting each other. And that ties in with the myth of Actaeon. So, okay, we're going to look at all of that. I want to talk a little bit, I'm going to read a little bit from some of the websites, from Britannica, from bits from Wikipedia, different places, just to talk about some of her different epithets and connections. So, the first one, she was, she's known as Trivia or Trivia. Okay, so just like, we think of trivia as something trivial, right? Like little facts about things, your Trivial Pursuit games and stuff, right? But trivia actually has to do with trivium or triple or trivia, because it's via is the is the word for road in Latin. So, and tri, of course, as it implies, there's a threefold aspect to that. So she is the goddess of the three roads. In other words, she's a goddess of the crossroads, which now it's not difficult to see how she, in her Artemis guise, becomes associated with Hecate, because Hecate is a goddess connected to the crossroads. And as they mention in this particular entry, this carries a somewhat dark and dangerous connotation, as it metaphorically pointed the way to the underworld. In 1st century CE play Medea, Seneca's titular sorceress calls on Trivia to cast a magic spell. She evokes a triple goddess of Diana, Selene, and Hecate. Okay, so this is probably where we see this idea come up in witchcraft, and specifies that she requires the powers of the latter, meaning Hecate. Okay. The 1st century poet Horace similarly wrote a magic incantation invoking the power of both Diana and Proserpina. Now, Proserpina is the Roman name for Persephone, who is queen of the underworld. Symbol of the crossroads is relevant to several aspects of Diana's domain. It can symbolize the paths hunters may encounter in the forest, lit only by the full moon. This symbolizes making choices in the dark, quote unquote, without the light of guidance. So again, now of course this is also the implication that Diana is a moon goddess, which is certainly an association that we have with her now. Whether that was an original association or not, that could be questionable. I would probably refer you back to my talk with Jake Stratton Kent on the archaic Hecate, because, talking about her initially as a moon goddess does have some, there's some complications there. I don't know that we can assume that she later on had that role. Whether that was her original role or not is still questionable. Okay. So here it's interesting. They say that Diana's role as a goddess of the underworld, or at least of ushering people between life and death, caused her early on to be conflated with Hecate and occasionally with Proserpina. However, her role as an underworld goddess appears to predate strong Greek influence. Okay, so now we're seeing a Chthonic Diana. Though the early Greek colony of Cumae had a cult of Hecate, it certainly had contacts with the Latins. So, again, we don't know who influenced who. A theater in her sanctuary at Lake Nemi included a pit and a tunnel that would have allowed actors to easily descend on one side of the stage and ascend on the other, indicating a connection between phases of the moon and descent by the moon goddess into the underworld. It is likely that in her underworld aspect, her original Latin worship did not have a distinct name like Luna was for her moon aspect. Although, again, as I'm going to note, Luna is sometimes listed, certainly listed by Livy and some other writers, as an entirely separate deity. So I don't know that that was original to her, but again, there does seem to be a connection, and certainly if she has an underworld responsibility, that moon connection is not far-fetched. Now they're saying, this says here, this is due to a seeming reluctance or taboo by the early Latins to name underworld deities, and the fact they believe the underworld to be silent, precluding naming. And certainly what you see in very early Etruscan and Roman, and what they're calling Latin culture, is this disposition towards death as a pollution. Okay, when you think of the parentalia or the lemuria or the different rites that there is for the dead, the dead are buried outside of the city. They're kind of kept away from the town. I mean, you revere and you honor the dead, mainly out of fear and dread. That's why they're often called manas or dismanibus. You'll see that on ancient headstones from Rome, right up, through the Empire period and a little later on. Manibus from manas, which is a term meaning, again, like the Furies, it means the kindly ones. So, it's this idea of, speaking to the dead, trying to speak to the dead respectfully, but largely out of kind of a fear that they are going to come. Ovid mentions in one of his writings, I know of it, you can probably easily look it up, but there's a rite that is performed, and I think it is I can't remember if it is the parentalia or the lemuria, but where basically the father of the family at midnight, goes around 12 times and throws beans over his shoulder. There's a kind of a rite that is meant to keep the ancestors who you've just venerated from following you home and staying there. Okay. It's also worth mentioning that the Romans always had the idea of the lares, or the genius or genius, the household gods. Okay. And, even the city itself, there's a genius or genius of the city of Rome. There's definitely this idea that there are spirits connected with every aspect. And your household gods were, the lares. You had to keep those gods happy. You had to keep, the hearth going. You had to keep the family situation, harmonious. And this was the way in which you guaranteed that you were going to have that you were going to have abundance, that you were going to have prosperity, that you were going to do well and avoid difficulty in some fashion. And that those relationships were very, very important. So, okay. So let's talk about the Rex Nemorensis here. Diana's a sacerdos, or priest, in the Arician wood, who held the position until someone challenged and killed him in a duel after breaking a branch from a certain tree of wood. This ever-open succession reveals the character and mission of the goddess as guarantor of kingly status through successive generations. Aha, so now we see this connection to sovereignty, right? Sovereignty as having rulership of an area. Her function as a bestower of authority to rule is also attested in the story related by Livy, in which a Sabine man who sacrifices a heifer to Diana wins for his country the seat of the Roman Empire. Okay. Unlike the Greek gods, Roman gods were considered to be noumena. Okay, yeah, that's the term that's used. Divine powers of presence and will that did not necessarily have physical form. At the time Rome was founded, Diana and other major Roman gods did not have much mythology per se. Okay, well, that's getting on a little bit later. But there's this idea of the Rex Nemorensis as being, again, having this kind of kingship of the forest and the woods, and having to be challenged for, it's almost like there has to be a blood sacrifice. So again, there's this bloody association with the cult of Diana. And if you've heard the things I've written about or spoken about the goddess Cybele and, some of these other really ancient mother goddesses from that region, you'll find that bloody, certainly the Cybele cult, there's castration, but there's this idea of bloody sacrifice as being associated with this kind of wildness of nature. Perhaps, again, that association with the forest and the woods. In kind of modern psychological symbolic speak, we tend to see forests as representing that kind of confused, that dark place that you're going into, that dark and potentially confusing place where you could get lost, where there may be wild beasts that you don't know about. It becomes almost metaphorical, not only of the unconscious, but it also ends up becoming metaphorical of, chaos and disorder. Because, if you think about one of the metaphors that's frequently used as far as when it comes to organized religion is the idea of what I call the fence jumper. Okay, so in other words, there's the nice, neat, confines. There's a nice, neat yard, with a fence, and it's sort of like, okay, you don't go beyond that fence. We've set the boundaries, we've dictated the outlines of how far you can think about the divine, how far you can think about the spiritual world. If you were raised in a traditional religion, and the more conservative, the more the closer those boundaries are. And, the idea is, you go outside that wall, you're going into the dark, scary place. You're going, you're potentially in the realm of the devil, right? You're in this spot where you could be easily tripped up, easily tricked, because it's chaotic. Here's our safe little known space. And a lot of people, especially when people are fearful and fearful of death, don't want to go outside that confined space. Okay? People who listen to this podcast and, possibly, other people who end up kind of falling onto some kind of path where they're seeking something outside the traditional, are probably, they're either thinking about jumping the fence or they are fence jumpers. Okay? So Diana is definitely associated with this space. So it's also not really surprising that she would become a kind of central deity when it comes to witchcraft and things like that. I would like to tell a couple of the stories now. The first one I'm going to tell is the story of Actaeon, because that one is connected to the Rex Nemorensis. It was, let me find there's a story. I'm reading this from a website called, it's called commonsmytholyoke.edu. Okay. It's, which I'm trying to think what university that is. Oh, Mount Holyoke. Okay, that's what it is. It's like Holyoke. I couldn't what that was. Now I realize Mount Holyoke University or college has this in their information. So this is from Ovid's Metamorphosis, and here's the sanctuary. Begins in a setting reminiscent of the sanctuary at Aricia. And it says, there was a valley there, all dark and shaded, with pine and cypress, sacred to Diana, Gargaphe its name was, and it held deep in its inner shade a secret grotto made by no art, unless you think of nature as being an artist. Out of rock and tufa she had formed an archway, where the shining water made slender watery sound, and the soon subsided into a pool and grassy banks around it. The goddess of the woods, when tired from hunting, came here to bathe her limbs in the cool crystal. The young Actaeon, taking a break from his hunt at high noon, interesting time, which is like, noon is like peak time, right? And often becomes synonymous with the peak of your life, stumbled into this sacred grove and happened upon Diana and her nymphs bathing in the cool waters. Okay, so this hunter has taken this this path, and now he's confronting the goddess. The nymphs tried to cover up their goddess, but she was too tall, and Actaeon caught a glimpse of her nude body. By viewing Diana's naked body without an invitation, Actaeon threatened her chastity, the virgin goddess's most prized virtue. Okay, so yeah, there is this definite idea of of virginity. This is not the mother goddess in this sense. This is the goddess Artemis. Artemis was definitely associated with virginal girls up to the time of adolescence. So, Diana may have had very, very similar associations, or these may have been the ones that are applied to her from Artemis. So it says, Diana would have shot him with her bow and arrows if she had not left them on the shore and was left vulnerable. Outraged by this mortal man's violation of her maidenhood, Diana cursed him with a splash of water on his head. From this spot on the top of Actaeon's head, a set of stag horns began to grow. Then, slowly, the rest of his body began to transform into that of a deer, and the hunter's heart was fearful. When trying to decide whether to hide in the woods or run back to the palace, his own hunting hounds caught his scent. However, it was not the hunter Actaeon's scent the dogs picked up, but the scent of a stag. His dogs, well trained by Actaeon himself, did not recognize their master, and since Actaeon had lost the ability to speak during his transformation, he was unable to warn them, and so he fled. Actaeon, once pursuer on this very ground, is now pursued, fleeing his old companions. When the dogs caught up to him, they tore him apart. Their prey, not their master whom they know, only a deer. Okay, so that is the story of Actaeon, which is very gruesome. So the punishment for viewing Diana is that he gets torn apart. Now, this is very similar to Tori and Artemis, because the idea is that looking upon that statue, brings that kind of, with the Tori and Artemis, you would be attacked, for that. Now, I have an entry on that. Let me just go to the right spot for that. Let's see. It's in my, let's see. Okay. It's on, what it is? I'd seen it under Artemis. That's what it was. I'm going to find it in a second. So there's definitely this idea of the, oh wait, here we go. That's what I'm looking for. Okay. So this has to do with, Amphistines. Okay. This is a Greek story, a Lacedaemonian, whose grandsons Astrabacus and Elopicus discovered the long-lost statue of Artemis, Oritha, which Orestes and Iphigenia had brought from Tauris. As a punishment for having set eyes on the sacred statue, the two children went mad. This was the statue in front of which young Spartans were beaten every year until their blood flowed. Okay? So, yeah, interesting, right? Tori and Artemis is the idea of her as this kind of breaker of young men. And it's, or this idea, again, very similarly, you have almost that Dionysian element, like to look upon the divine is to go mad. Or to go mad or to burn up, really. In this case, it's a statue, not the actual goddess. But, you see this idea of Artemis as kind of having this very violent streak, especially towards young men. Now, and that particular story is often associated with the Rex Nemorensis. There's this idea that he is the king who is the hunter, or he is the this special. He's in this special role for the goddess of the hunt, right? And then he becomes the hunted. So, so there's definitely this hunter-hunted motif that you see with Diana. Now, the other story I'm going to read to you is from the Aeneid, okay? And while Diana, this is the only place where she appears in the Aeneid, which is in chapter, or book 11, I should say. And this is during the time when Aeneas is at war with the Latins. He's at war with Turnus over Lavinia, the beautiful queen who is... she ends up being the, she basically, when she shows up, there's this prophecy about this hero coming. And of course, Aeneas, as we know, is the Trojan hero. Even though he's not technically from Troy, he fought on the side of Troy in the Trojan War, and he was one of the few people to survive. and he's the son of Venus, okay? Who Venus, by the way, in the beginning of the Aeneid appears in the guise of Diana. So she's this goddess. She has a few more associations in Roman mythology than she does in Greek. She tends to be more of a mother of the Roman people, again, because of her connection to Aeneas. And it's like, just as the Greeks had, people like Odysseus and Agamemnon and, Achilles and some of these other heroes associated with them and with their royal lineages, Rome, having conquered Greece, now actually goes back to the Trojans and the proud line of the Trojans and says, well, our national hero and founder is Trojan, okay, or fought on the side of Troy. So, and he's, of course, a demigod, because they always have to be demigods to prove the royal lineage. So the Aeneas, of course, throughout the Aeneid is actually quite pious. You see a guy who pays very strict attention to oracles and to so you get a real sense of the way in which, signs from nature were important. He also tends to be a little bit more of a gentle guy. He's not necessarily out there to commit war, which is probably why Diana doesn't really favor him very much in this one. Who she favors is a warrior called Camilla, and it's female. She's fighting on the side of Turnus, okay, who is fighting against Aeneas. And she decides she wants to be at the front of the line. She wants to lead the charge against Aeneas's army by herself. And this is after the death of Aeneas' friend Pallas, so he's not in the best frame of mind. Okay, so we have here is that Diana speaks to Opus. Okay, and it says, I'll read this piece to you. This is in the Robert Fitzgerald translation of the Aeneid. She says, in heaven, meanwhile, Diana spoke to Opus, the fleet huntress, one of the divine virgins in her train. Her lips opened in sadness, and she said, Sister, now Camilla goes her way to the cruel war equipped with bow and quiver, weapons of ours, but all in vain. Cherish her as I may beyond the rest. No new love this come just now to Diana, moving my heart with pleasure. Years ago, when haters of his insolent power drove him out of Privernum, ancient realm and town, Medibus took his infant child in flight amid the struggles of that war to share his exile. By her mother's name Camilla, which by the way means freeborn, so there's that idea of sovereignty, or Casmilla, which he changed to Camilla, okay? So that tends to mean freeborn. Now he carried her before him close to his breast and toiled for refuge on long ridges in the wilderness, though spears of grim pursuit were everywhere behind, and Volscian patrols cast a wide net. Lo and behold, square in his path in flood, the torrent Amasensus, foaming high, ran over banks and brim, filled by so wild a cloudburst. As the man prepared to swim it, love for his infant stayed him, and he feared for his dear burden. Weighing all the choices possible, he settled suddenly and desperately on this. In his tough hand he chanced to carry a battle spear of oak, knotted and seasoned. Now to this he tied his child, encased in cork tree bark, and bound her trimly in the middle of the shaft. He balanced it in his big hand and prayed to the air of heaven, Daughter of Latona, and that's Diana's mother, Diana, kindly virgin of the groves, and there's that kindly, I, her father, swear this child shall be thy servant. The first weapon she embraces thine, as by thy mercy through the air she escapes the enemy. I beg thee, goddess, take her as thine own, this girl committed now to the veering wind. He then drew back his arm and let the spun shaft fly. So basically he ties her to a spear and chucks it. The waters dinned below, and over the rushing stream, small and forlorn, Camilla soared across upon the whistling spear shaft. Well aware of troops in force approaching from behind, Medibus took to the river. Spear and child in triumph he recovered from the turf, his offering to the Virgin of the Crossroads. Okay, so she's called Trivia. In fact, earlier they referred to her as Chthonia. Now, not a city gave him sanctuary, public or private, nor would he himself, because of his fierce nature, yield to any. So he lived out his life upon the shepherd's lonely mountains. Here in undergrowth, amid rough haunts of beasts, he nursed his daughter, putting her to the breast of a wild mare, whose teats he milked into her tender mouth. When the small child took her first steps, he armed her hands with a sharp javelin, and hung a bow and quiver from her infant shoulder. No gold headband, no flowing outer garment covered her, but a tiger skin hung down her back from head to foot. And as a child, she flung play darts with her soft hand, and whirled a sling stone on a strap around her head, to fell a crane of Strymon or a swan. Then many mothers in the Tuscan towns desired her in vain to be their daughter. All her contentment being with Diana, The girl remained untouched and ever-cherished passion for arms and for virginity. I wish that she had not been swept away in this campaign or tried to challenge Trojans. She would still be my dear, one of my sisters. Come, though, granted heart-faced is at hand. Go gliding out of heaven's nymph and visit Latin lands, where, with unlucky omen, battle is begun. Here are my weapons. Take one vengeful shaft out of the quiver. By this, let any Trojan or Italian, one or the other, who may violate her sacred body with a wound, pay back in blood an equal penalty to me. Then I shall carry, pillowed in a cloud, the body of the pitiable one, her war gear intact, and her final rest in her own land and tomb. When she had finished, Opis dropped from heaven through light airs with a rushing sound wrapped in a dark whirlwind. Okay, so this is what's happening. So Diana sends one of her virgin huntress, Opis is kind of almost like a daemonic spirit in this sense. She is an intermediary who is going on behalf of Diana to look after. Now, the fate has dictated that Camilla will die in this situation, but Opis will take revenge, on behalf of Diana, and then will take the body away. So Diana is looking after her own, just as Artemis had looked after Hippolytus, who of course is a man, but he was also a virgin and had remained, chaste and dedicated to her. So that was, so she does tend to favor those who do that. So this is the story of where we see Diana in the Aeneid, and earlier we do see her referred to as Chthonia. So. So again, there's that triple kind of crossroads kind of aspect. So, this association with her, with feminine warriorship in particular, with chaos, with the forest, with the groves, and with this idea of these men kind of engaged in bloody combat, to that this is sort of the requirement of her priesthood and of her way. This is one of there again, it's very similar to Artemis, but there are some differences there. To me, there's something even more, because of their idea of the noumena. It's I feel like this Diana is a little bit more Chthonic, more chaotic, and of course by this time Virgil is making her again a queen in heaven. We see this in some of these other writings as well. Let me just find. There's one that I had wanted to mention here. Where was it? Let's see. Say we have a temple of Diana on the Aventine, the foundation of the charter of the Latin League, said to date back to King Servius Tullius in 6th century BCE. In the cult there, Diana was considered protector of the lower classes, especially slaves. The Ides, the 13th of August, her festival at Rome in Aricia, was a holiday for slaves. So yeah, she's got this strong association, which makes her very similar to Bacchus or Dionysus in that respect as well. She's more for the common person. And if you think about that story about, Camilla's father living in the wilds, there seems to be more of the idea of the wild and free person, which also may be the virginity, because then the implication may be there that when one gets married or one starts engaging in sexual relations, perhaps with the expectation of bearing a family, now you lose that sovereignty. Okay. You lose that independence that you have. So she has this rather interesting association. I had wanted to see, there was another one that I had wanted to look at, because I feel like there's a little bit more on the later Diana, but I think actually I'm gonna, for some reason I had it up and it's gone, and I'm like, you know what, I think there's a sign in that, I don't want to get into that too much, because I feel like that becomes the Diana who's associated more with Artemis, and we've already talked about that. So so this is more of we've attempted to look more at her origins in this one, and at some of these specific stories from Roman writings, Latin and Roman writings on her. So I think that's where I want to stop, because I don't want to go on too long about this, again, as a lot of this material is also covered in the Artemis podcast. So with that, I'm going to end. I'd like to thank you all very much for listening. Thank you very much for everyone on Patreon who is supporting this. And I've got, some, getting quite a few more people. And some larger contributions, and I'm, very happy about that, very humbled by that. I really appreciate people's faith in my work and what I'm doing. And if you would like to join Patreon, there's patreon.com/Chthonia. I'm on social media as Chthonia Podcast, 2 words on Instagram and Twitter. 2 words on Facebook. I always get this wrong. 2 words on Facebook, 1 word on Instagram and Twitter, and just Chthonia on YouTube. And obviously, Chthonia.net is my website where I keep everything together. If there's new announcements and things. Usually I go to social media first because not everybody spends their time reading static websites. But I am going to try to do some more updating of that website and some of my private coaching stuff as well that I do on the side. That I do. That's really how I make my money. This is more what I do to kind of share what I know with people. So again, thank you very much for listening, and hope you're there for the next episode.